The municipal burial system known as Potter's Field emerged from specific design requirements that cities faced in the 19th century. Urban administrators needed to process large numbers of unclaimed dead while maintaining public health standards and managing limited budgetary resources. The system they created functioned through a series of interlocking mechanisms that made mass anonymous burial not just possible, but inevitable. The foundational premise began with classification. Municipal authorities divided the dead into two categories: those with social connections who could claim them, and those without. This binary sorting mechanism operated at the first point of contact, the city morgue. When a body arrived, officials initiated a 24-hour waiting period during which relatives or associates could identify and claim the deceased. This temporal boundary served as the primary filter. Those unclaimed after this period automatically entered the Potter's Field pipeline. The physical infrastructure reflected these operational priorities. New York City's Potter's Field, initially located at what would become Washington Square, occupied 9.5 acres at the city's northern edge. The choice of location revealed the system's core assumption: these burial grounds belonged at the periphery, away from the living city. Between 1795 and 1803, this site received approximately 125,000 bodies, many victims of yellow fever epidemics. The sheer volume demanded industrial-scale burial methods. The burial methodology itself embodied efficiency over individuality. Workers excavated trenches to standardized dimensions, initially 15 feet wide by 10 feet deep, later modified to accommodate 3 layers of bodies. Pine coffins, the cheapest available option, were stacked in precise geometric patterns. Adults occupied the bottom layer, placed 3 deep and 2 across. Children and infants filled spaces between adult coffins, maximizing spatial efficiency. This stacking system allowed a single trench to hold 150 bodies in a space that individual graves would accommodate perhaps 20%. Record-keeping systems prioritized administrative tracking over personal memorial. Ledger books recorded each burial by number, not name. The entry format included permit number, section number, plot number, grave number, age of deceased, date of permit issue, date of death, cause of death, examining physician's signature, place of death, and burial date. Notably absent, the deceased's name in most cases. The system tracked bodies as units of municipal waste management, not as individuals deserving remembrance. The economic architecture reinforced anonymity. In 1966, the city spent approximately $75 for an adult burial and $29 for an infant. Half this cost was reimbursed by New York State, but only for specific categories: state charges and Social Security collectors. The reimbursement structure created perverse incentives. Bodies that generated state reimbursement received slightly more attention to documentation. Those fully funded by the city, vagrants, unidentified persons, the absolutely destitute, received minimal processing. Professional burial societies occasionally intervened, but their involvement revealed another system assumption: the Hebrew Free Burial Society, Catholic societies, and Chinese burial associations claimed bodies of their members, but this required pre-death membership or community identification. The system thus penalized those without strong communal ties. A Jewish pauper with synagogue connections might receive proper burial. One without such connections went to Potter's Field despite religious prohibitions against common burial. The medical establishment's involvement added another layer of systematic dehumanization. Medical schools required cadavers for anatomical study. Potter's Field provided a convenient supply. Bodies unclaimed after 24 hours became available for medical use before burial. This created a secondary sorting system: bodies suitable for dissection versus those too decomposed or diseased. The former might spend months in medical schools before eventual burial, in even more fragmentary form. Transportation infrastructure connected these various nodes. The dead boat operated on a fixed schedule, departing from the Bronx twice weekly. This vessel could carry 20 to 30 coffins per trip. The scheduling meant bodies might wait several days before transport, requiring additional storage facilities. These holding areas, essentially warehouses for the dead, operated on first-in, first-out principles, further erasing individual identity in favor of logistical efficiency. The labor system embedded class distinctions into the burial process itself. From 1869 onward, inmates from Blackwell's Island, later Rikers Island, performed the actual burials. The city thus used the incarcerated to bury the indigent, creating a closed loop of marginalization. Inmates received work assignments to burial detail based on behavior and perceived emotional stability. The Department of Correction developed screening procedures to identify prisoners who could handle corpses without emotional upset. This selection process treated both the dead and their gravediggers as requiring management rather than dignity. Spatial allocation followed rigid geometric logic. The cemetery grid system, introduced in 1872, divided the ground into numbered sections. Each section contained multiple trenches. Each trench held multiple layers. This three-dimensional matrix allowed precise location tracking. Section 12, Trench 4, Layer B, Position 23. The numbering system enabled theoretical exhumation if families later claimed bodies, though in practice few such reclamations occurred. The grid also enabled systematic reuse. After 25 years, the city could legally excavate old sections and begin anew, treating the cemetery as recyclable urban infrastructure. The regulatory framework codified these practices through municipal law. The 1823 Charter of the City of New York granted the Common Council authority over burying grounds for strangers and paupers. Subsequent legislation refined procedures but maintained core assumptions. An 1866 law prohibited new burial grounds within city limits but exempted Potter's Field as necessary public infrastructure. The legal classification, necessary public infrastructure, placed mass burial on par with sewers and roads in urban planning priorities. Disease control measures intensified systematic processing. Following cholera outbreaks in 1832 and 1849, health officials mandated rapid burial and chemical treatment of Potter's Field corpses. Quicklime became standard protocol, accelerating decomposition while reducing disease risk. This public health intervention, while scientifically sound, further erased physical remains. Bodies treated with quicklime decomposed within months rather than years, enabling faster plot recycling. The notification system, ostensibly designed to allow family claims, actually functioned to accelerate disposal. Law required reporting deaths to local police, who notified the chief medical examiner if unclaimed within 24 hours. Bodies moved automatically to Potter's Field processing. But notification often failed for transients, immigrants, and others lacking fixed addresses or social networks. The system assumed stable residential patterns that poverty and marginalization disrupted. Seasonal variations revealed system priorities. Winter burials posed logistical challenges when ground froze. Rather than delay interments, workers pre-excavated trenches in autumn, covering them with planks until needed. Bodies accumulated in temporary storage during severe weather, then received mass burial when conditions improved. This practice, necessary for operational continuity, meant some corpses waited weeks between death and interment, stored in unheated facilities where decomposition nonetheless progressed. Financial accounting procedures treated bodies as expense categories. Municipal budgets listed Potter's Field costs under sanitation and health, not cemeteries or human services. This categorization revealed administrative thinking. These burials addressed sanitation problems, not human needs. Budget line items included excavation equipment maintenance, quicklime procurement, coffin contracts, transportation fuel, and guard salaries. Notably absent any allocation for markers, monuments, or memorial services. The contract system for coffin procurement emphasized cost minimization. The city awarded annual contracts to the lowest bidder meeting minimal specifications. Pine construction, 6 feet length for adults, proportionally smaller for children. Contractors delivered coffins in bulk to staging areas. Quality control focused on structural integrity for transportation, not dignity of interment. Warped boards, exposed nail heads, and gaps between planks were common and acceptable within contract terms. Plot allocation algorithms maximized efficiency. Children under 2 occupied dedicated sections, allowing denser packing. Stillborn infants might be placed 10 to a coffin. Adults required individual coffins but shared grave spaces. The positioning protocol specified head-to-toe alternation, allowing closer spacing. This systematic approach treated bodies as geometric objects requiring optimal arrangement rather than individuals deserving separate space. Disinterment procedures, when rarely invoked, revealed the system's true priorities. Families seeking to reclaim bodies faced bureaucratic obstacles, proving relationship, paying administrative fees, hiring private excavation crews, and accepting whatever remains could be identified. The decomposition accelerated by quicklime often made identification impossible. The city kept no photographs, dental records, or identifying materials. Families might receive any bones from the appropriate trench section, with no guarantee they belonged to their relative. The assumption underlying every component was categorical. Certain lives possessed insufficient social or economic value to merit individual burial. This wasn't articulated as policy, but embedded in every operational decision. The 24-hour claiming period assumed people had communities monitoring their whereabouts. The numerical recording system assumed names held no significance once social ties severed. The mass burial methodology assumed these dead required only disposal, not memorialization. The peripheral locations assumed the living shouldn't be reminded of society's failures. Each assumption reinforced the others, creating an interlocking system where anonymity and erasure became not just probable but inevitable. The architectural manifestation of these principles appeared in every design decision. When Potter's Field relocated from Washington Square to 49th Street and 4th Avenue in 1823, city planners selected a site far from existing development. The location choice embedded an assumption: proximity to the unnamed dead diminished property values and social standing. This spatial segregation created physical distance between those who belonged to the city's social fabric and those who had fallen through it. The relocation pattern itself revealed systematic thinking. Each time urban expansion approached Potter's Field, authorities moved it further peripherally. Washington Square became unsuitable when wealthy estates encroached. The 49th Street location served until the 1840s, when northward development again forced relocation. Randall's Island in the East River became the next site, literally casting the dead off Manhattan Island. This wasn't mere convenience but encoded belief. The socially disconnected dead belonged beyond the boundaries of proper civic life. Infrastructure development at each location followed identical patterns. First, workers cleared existing vegetation. Then they established a geometric grid aligned to compass points, not topography. This imposed order ignored natural landscape features that might have provided dignity or beauty. Drainage systems channeled water away from trenches but made no provision for landscaping or beautification. Access roads accommodated burial wagons but not visitor carriages. Every infrastructure choice prioritized operational efficiency over commemorative function. The temporal mechanics of the system created inevitable anonymity. The 24-hour claiming period originated from practical constraints, morgue capacity and decomposition rates, but became rigid protocol regardless of circumstances. A laborer killed in a workplace accident on Friday might not be missed until Monday, by which time burial proceedings had begun. Immigrants with families abroad had no possibility of notification within the time frame. The inflexibility of timing guaranteed that temporary disconnection became permanent erasure. Documentation practices extended beyond simple record-keeping to active identity suppression. When bodies arrived with personal effects, letters, photographs, religious items, protocol required their removal and disposal. These items, which might have enabled later identification, were classified as potential disease vectors requiring destruction. The systematic elimination of identifying materials transformed potentially reclaimable individuals into permanently anonymous units. The professional networks surrounding Potter's Field reinforced its dehumanizing function. Coffin manufacturers specialized in minimal specification boxes, developing production methods that reduced costs below what individual craftsmen could achieve. These specialists operated factories producing nothing but pauper coffins, creating an entire industry around efficient disposal of the poor. Transportation contractors maintained fleets of wagons designed for stacking coffins like cordwood. Even the quicklime suppliers developed special grades optimized for rapid decomposition rather than preservation. Medical professional involvement extended beyond receiving cadavers. Physicians serving as city coroners developed streamlined examination protocols for Potter's Field candidates. Unlike deaths among the wealthy, which might receive extensive investigation, pauper deaths received cursory review. Found dead became a sufficient cause of death for record-keeping purposes. This medical efficiency meant that murders among the marginalized might go undetected, their victims buried without investigation in anonymous trenches. The seasonal rhythms of burial revealed how natural constraints shaped systematic practices. Spring floods on Randall's Island occasionally exposed previous burials, requiring rapid reinterment. Rather than treating such events as dignity violations, administrators developed protocols for efficient reburial, treating exposed remains as logistical problems. Summer heat accelerated decomposition, requiring more frequent boat trips and faster processing. Winter freezes delayed excavation but not death, creating backlogs managed through temporary storage expansion. Each seasonal challenge generated procedural responses that further mechanized the handling of human remains. Religious institutions' interactions with Potter's Field illuminated class-based dignity differentials. While burial societies prevented some coreligionists from anonymous burial, they operated through membership models that excluded the most marginalized. Annual dues, meeting attendance, and social respectability requirements meant that Jewish alcoholics, Catholic prostitutes, or Chinese opium addicts might be excluded from communal burial assistance, despite nominal religious affiliation. The societies thus reinforced Potter's Field's function as the destination for those failing both secular and religious community standards. The financial architecture revealed through budget documents showed precise calibration of minimum acceptable standards. The $75 adult burial cost in 1966 broke down into specific components: $12 for the coffin, $8 for transportation, $15 for labor provided by inmates at below minimum wages, $3 for quicklime, $2 for administrative processing, and $35 for overhead, a category that included everything from shovel maintenance to guard salaries. Each line item had been minimized through competitive bidding and efficiency measures. The city knew exactly how cheaply a human could be disposed of while maintaining basic sanitation standards. The evolution of burial techniques showed continuous optimization. Early trenches ran perpendicular to the shoreline, but flooding problems led to reorientation parallel to water edges. The three-layer system replaced earlier two-layer approaches when space constraints demanded greater density. The introduction of mechanical excavation in the 1920s allowed deeper trenches, enabling four-layer burial in some sections. Each innovation increased capacity without increasing dignity, treating the cemetery as an engineering problem requiring technical solutions. The administrative structure governing Potter's Field created bureaucratic distance between decision-makers and burial realities. The Department of Correction managed daily operations, but policy came from the Department of Welfare. Funding flowed through the Department of Finance. Health regulations originated from the Board of Health. This institutional fragmentation meant no single authority took responsibility for the human dimension of mass burial. Each department optimized its narrow mandate: security, cost, efficiency, disease prevention, without considering cumulative dehumanization. The classification system for the dead revealed hierarchical assumptions about social worth. Bodies were sorted into categories: adult male, adult female, child, infant, and fetal. Within these, subcategories existed: identified versus unknown, city charge versus state charge, anatomical versus direct burial. Each classification triggered different procedures, documentation requirements, and reimbursement rates. The system could process a body through 7 different categorical decisions before burial, each reducing individual identity to administrative characteristics. Labor management practices embedded class relations into burial operations. Inmates assigned to burial detail received marginally better food rations and counted days toward good behavior early release. This incentive system meant the most motivated workers were those seeking to leave incarceration, creating psychological distance from their grim task. Guards supervising burial details received hazard pay, acknowledging the work's unpleasant nature while ensuring its continuation. The labor system thus exploited the incarcerated to manage the dead, using one marginalized population to dispose of another. The physical mechanics of trenching followed engineering specifications developed for efficiency. Optimal trench dimensions, 10 feet deep, 15 feet wide, 50 feet long, derived from equipment reach and soil stability calculations, not human-scale considerations. The 3-foot spacing between trenches allowed equipment access while maximizing burial density. Covers consisted of 2 feet of soil, the minimum preventing odor and animal intrusion. These specifications, developed through trial and error, created an industrialized burial process treating human remains as fill material, requiring proper coverage depth. Record-keeping evolution showed progressive abstraction. Early ledgers included occasional names and brief descriptions: Irish woman, approximately 40, found at 5 points. By the 1890s, entries reduced to numbers and categories. The 1920s introduced pre-printed forms with checkboxes, eliminating narrative space entirely. This documentary evolution paralleled the systematic erasure of individuality, creating official records that preserved administrative data while eliminating human stories. The public health rationale underlying Potter's Field revealed period assumptions about disease and social contamination. Medical authorities believed poverty itself created miasmic conditions. Breeding disease. The poor died from their environments, and their bodies threatened to perpetuate these conditions. Rapid burial with chemical acceleration thus protected the living from both biological and social contamination. This conflation of poverty with disease justified minimal dignity in disposal, framing mass burial as public health necessity rather than social failure. Comparison with contemporary burial practices for the wealthy illuminated the systematic differentials. While Potter's Field processed bodies within days, elite funerals might extend across weeks, with elaborate viewing periods, processions, and memorial services. Private cemeteries sold perpetual care, ensuring graves would be maintained forever. Family plots created intergenerational memorial spaces. Monuments recorded names, dates, and achievements. Every element absent from Potter's Field existed in inverse proportion in elite burial grounds, creating mirror systems that reflected and reinforced social hierarchies. The legal framework's evolution showed how systematic anonymity became encoded in law. Early regulations simply authorized pauper burial. Later amendments specified procedures, timelines, and authorities. By 1900, the legal code detailed everything from coffin dimensions to excavation depths. This legislative specificity created binding protocols that individual administrators could not alter, even if moved by compassion. The law mandated efficiency over dignity, encoding systematic principles into unchangeable requirements. The design philosophy underlying Potter's Field ultimately rested on a fundamental assumption: certain lives ended in social death before biological death. The friendless, familyless, and resourceless had already exited meaningful social existence. Physical death merely formalized this exclusion. The burial system thus didn't create anonymity, but institutionalized pre-existing social invisibility. Every mechanism, from the 24-hour claim period to the numerical recording system to the mass trenches, manifested this core belief in material form. The system succeeded perfectly in its actual purpose, efficiently disposing of those whose lives had been deemed disposable long before their deaths. The Potter's Field system contained multiple failure modes built into its operational architecture years before any individual burial took place. These latent conditions existed at the intersection of maintenance practices, organizational structures, and human psychological responses to mass mortality. Each component functioned correctly in isolation but created vulnerability when combined with the others. Maintenance configuration states throughout the Potter's Field infrastructure operated on deferred schedules that prioritized immediate burial needs over long-term system integrity. The wooden markers used to identify trench sections deteriorated within 2 to 3 years due to weather exposure and soil chemistry accelerated by quicklime. Rather than systematic replacement, workers installed new markers only when actively using adjacent sections. This created temporal gaps where entire sections became unmarked, their contents known only through ledger books stored in administrative offices miles away. When clerks needed to locate specific burials from previous years, they faced unmarked ground with only approximate measurements from fixed landmarks that themselves shifted: trees that died, temporary structures that moved, shorelines that eroded. The ferry dock infrastructure at Randall's Island exemplified systematic neglect justified by the clientele served. Piling showed visible rot by 1880, 15 years after installation. Engineering reports recommended replacement, but budget authorities deferred maintenance, reasoning that a dock serving only the dead warranted minimal investment. Workers adapted by limiting load weights and approaching at reduced speeds, informal accommodations that became standard practice. These adaptations trained personnel to accept degraded infrastructure as normal, creating psychological baselines where dysfunction became expected. Prior incidents that presaged systematic failures received minimal investigation. In 1878, high tides flooded active burial sections, mixing decomposing remains from different trenches. Workers reburied the commingled bones without attempting identification or segregation. The incident report filed by a corrections officer noted only temporary disruption to burial operations without addressing the complete loss of burial integrity for hundreds of individuals. This bureaucratic minimization of dignity violations became standard. As long as operations resumed, the human cost went unrecorded. The alarm system for notifying staff of incoming bodies consisted of a single bell at the dock connected by wire to the administrative building. By 1885, the wire required constant repair due to corrosion from salt air. During failures, boat operators used tin horns, whose sound carried poorly in wind. The backup to the backup was simply waiting until someone noticed the boat's arrival. Each degradation in notification systems increased the likelihood that bodies would remain unprocessed for hours, accelerating decomposition and making any potential identification more difficult. Training for burial workers emphasized physical techniques, proper lifting to avoid back injury, quicklime handling to prevent chemical burns, tool maintenance to ensure excavation efficiency. Entirely absent was any training on dignity, respect, or the psychological impact of handling human remains. Workers learned through informal apprenticeship with experienced inmates who had themselves never received formal instruction. This training vacuum meant that each work crew developed its own practices, some maintaining minimal respectfulness while others treated bodies with active callousness born from psychological self-protection. The psychological environment surrounding Potter's Field created specific maladaptations among workers. Correctional officers supervising burial details reported that inmates initially showed distress when handling remains, particularly children's bodies. Within weeks, this distress transformed into either emotional numbing or dark humor. Officers, recognizing this transformation as necessary for operational continuity, encouraged detachment. "Think of them as sides of beef," one training directive suggested. This systematic dehumanization protected workers' psychological stability, while ensuring they could never advocate for improved dignity in burial practices. Organizational factors created information silos that prevented systematic improvement. The Department of Correction managed daily operations but had no input on burial policies. The Department of Welfare set policies but never visited burial sites. The Board of Health imposed regulations but didn't monitor compliance. Budget authorities allocated funds based on previous year's expenditures without investigating whether those funds met actual needs. This fragmentation meant that problems visible at operational levels never reached decision-makers who might address them. The contracting system for supplies created perverse incentives. Coffin suppliers won contracts by bidding below competitors, encouraging progressive quality reductions. The 1890 contract specified pine boards, assembled with nails, without mentioning thickness, dryness, or construction quality. Suppliers met specifications using green wood that warped within days, creating gaps that let in water and soil. When workers complained, administrators noted that contracts were met legally. The next year's bidding produced even cheaper coffins as suppliers learned exactly how low quality could go while meeting minimal legal requirements. Documentation practices created false precision that masked actual chaos. Ledger entries showed exact burial locations, Section 15, Row 8, Plot 17, but ground conditions often made these designations meaningless. Erosion moved landmarks, repeated excavation and reburial shifted trench boundaries. The neat grid on paper bore little relationship to the jumbled reality underground. When families occasionally sought to reclaim bodies, workers excavated general areas rather than specific plots, hoping to find remains that might plausibly match descriptions. The temporal rhythms of the work created systematic pressures toward efficiency over accuracy. Boats arrived twice weekly with 20 to 30 bodies requiring burial within days. Work crews sized for average flow became overwhelmed during epidemics or extreme weather that delayed previous burials. Rather than expanding crews, supervisors demanded faster work. Careful placement gave way to hasty interment. Record-keeping simplified to essential minimums. Quality erosions made during crises became new baselines, never returning to previous standards even when pressure reduced. Supervision structures embedded neglect. Correctional officers assigned to Potter's Field were typically those lacking seniority or facing disciplinary issues. The assignment was understood as punishment, creating resentful supervisors overseeing reluctant workers burying unwanted dead. This concentration of institutional negativity meant that any individual attempting conscientious work faced active discouragement. "Don't be a hero" became informal policy, warning against any effort beyond minimum requirements. The physical isolation of island burial sites created practical and psychological separation from oversight. Senior administrators might visit annually for cursory inspections, announced weeks in advance. Daily reality remained invisible to anyone with power to mandate improvements. This isolation allowed informal practices to develop unchecked, using burial tools for other purposes, taking extended breaks that delayed interments, developing shortcuts that violated written procedures but saved effort. Budget allocation cycles created predictable resource shortages. Funds were distributed annually based on previous year's consumption, without adjustment for inflation, wage increases, or deteriorating infrastructure. By mid-year, supplies often ran low. Workers stretched quicklime by using less than specified amounts. Coffin quality degraded as suppliers exhausted better materials. Transportation schedules extended to save fuel. Each economy further reduced the already minimal dignity afforded to the dead. The knowledge management system for burial operations existed entirely in human memory. Experienced inmates knew which sections contained which year's burials, where erosion made excavation dangerous, how to interpret cryptic ledger entries. When these workers completed sentences, their knowledge left with them. New crews rediscovered problems solved years earlier. Repeated mistakes previously corrected, lost track of burial patterns known to predecessors. This institutional amnesia meant that operational knowledge never accumulated into systematic improvement. Health and safety regulations focused exclusively on worker protection, not dignity for the dead. Protocols specified glove requirements for handling bodies, mask usage during exhumations, and vaccination schedules for burial crews. Nowhere did regulations address respectful handling, prompt burial, or accurate record-keeping. This regulatory focus communicated clear priorities: workers' bodies mattered, paupers' bodies didn't. The message internalized throughout the organization, creating cultural permission for dignitary neglect. The feedback mechanisms that might have improved operations were systematically disabled. Families who complained about burial conditions were directed to file written grievances with departments that had no operational authority. Workers who suggested improvements were told to focus on their assigned tasks. External observers, journalists, reformers, health inspectors, were denied access for security reasons. The system thus insulated itself from any information that might challenge its functioning. Prior warnings about systematic inadequacies were documented but ignored. An 1882 Health Department inspection found graves of insufficient depth, incomplete covering of remains, and inadequate record-keeping. The report recommended immediate corrections. A follow-up inspection in 1884 found identical problems. By 1886, inspectors stopped noting deficiencies that clearly wouldn't be addressed. The inspection process became theatrical compliance rather than actual oversight, with both inspectors and operators understanding that nothing would change. The human factors engineering of the burial process created inevitable emotional detachment. Workers handled dozens of bodies daily, each requiring physical effort without emotional engagement. The repetitive nature, lift, carry, place, cover, record, transformed human remains into work units. Psychological research would later term this moral disengagement, but burial crews discovered it pragmatically. The system required workers to suppress natural human responses to death, creating psychological conditions where indignity became unremarkable. Procedural documentation revealed systematic biases through what it emphasized and what it omitted. Pages detailed excavation angles to prevent cave-ins, but no guidance addressed handling remains respectfully. Chapters covered tool maintenance schedules without mentioning grave marker replacement. Sections on record-keeping focused on administrative compliance rather than preserving human identity. The procedures thus trained workers in a specific form of blindness, seeing only operational challenges while ignoring human dignity. The accumulation of these latent conditions created a system primed for dehumanization. Each individual component, degraded infrastructure, psychological adaptations, organizational silos, resource constraints, might have been addressable in isolation. Combined, they created interlocking vulnerabilities that made dignitary failure inevitable. The system didn't suddenly begin failing. It was designed with failure modes built into its fundamental architecture. When criticism eventually arose, operators could truthfully claim they followed all procedures, met all regulations, and stayed within all budgets. The horror lay not in violation of the system but in its proper functioning. The technological systems supporting burial operations revealed design choices that prioritized cost over capability. The ledger system used paper volumes that deteriorated in the humid conditions near water. Ink formulations, selected for cheapness, faded within years. When administrators proposed transitioning to more durable record-keeping methods in 1888, cost analysis showed that replacing faded ledgers every decade was cheaper than initial investment in quality materials. This decision encoded impermanence into the historical record, ensuring that identities would fade along with the ink recording them. Communication failures between Potter's Field and city morgues created systematic misidentifications. Bodies were tagged at the morgue with paper labels tied with string. During transport, particularly in summer heat or winter storms, these labels often separated. Boat crews developed informal protocols, placing detached labels with the nearest body that corrupted whatever minimal identification existed. By the time bodies reached burial crews, perhaps half bore incorrect or missing labels. The response wasn't improved labeling, but acceptance that identification was best effort rather than essential. The chemistry of decomposition in mass graves created conditions that made later identification impossible, even when families sought reclamation. Quicklime accelerated breakdown but did so unevenly, depending on soil moisture, body placement, and seasonal temperatures. Some remained skeletonized within months while others partially mummified. When exhumation occurred, workers confronted heterogeneous mixtures of bones, tissue, and clothing that bore no relationship to original burial patterns. The chemical chaos underground mocked the neat grid system recorded in ledgers. Shift patterns for burial crews created knowledge discontinuities. Day shifts handled regular burials while night shifts managed epidemic overflows. Weekend crews differed from weekday staff. Each shift developed distinct practices, shortcuts, and interpretations of procedures. A body buried by Monday day shift might be recorded differently than one buried by Friday night shift, creating inconsistencies that compounded over time. Supervisors, themselves working shifts, never gained comprehensive understanding of all operational variations. The psychological profile of workers selected for Potter's Field duty revealed institutional assumptions. Corrections officials assigned inmates they considered hardened, those showing least emotional response during intake psychological evaluations. This selection for emotional blunting meant crews were staffed by individuals already practicing psychological self-protection. The work then deepened these defenses, creating feedback loops where emotional detachment was simultaneously a qualification for and result of the assignment. Equipment design reflected purely functional considerations. Burial carts were sized to maximize coffin capacity, resulting in unwieldy vehicles that required multiple workers to maneuver. Hinges and latches were positioned for easy loading rather than dignified handling. Ramps angled steeply to save space, causing coffins to slide and impact during unloading. Each design element prioritized efficiency over respect, training workers through physical interaction that bodies were cargo requiring transport optimization. The seasonal workforce variations created additional discontinuities. Summer heat made burial work particularly unpleasant, leading to higher turnover. Administrators responded by relaxing selection criteria, accepting workers normally deemed unsuitable. These temporary workers received abbreviated training focused solely on immediate tasks. When autumn arrived and regular crews returned, they found burial grounds reorganized by summer workers who hadn't understood long-term systematic requirements. Sections were mislabeled, trenches dug in wrong orientations, records kept haphazardly. Nutritional policies for burial crews revealed calculations of minimum human maintenance. Workers received additional food rations, not for humanitarian reasons, but because physical labor required caloric input. The supplement consisted of cheapest available calories, additional bread, occasional salt pork, watered soup. Nutritional deficiencies were common, leading to weakness that slowed work. Rather than improving rations, supervisors reduced daily burial quotas, accepting slower processing rather than investing in worker health. The medical screening of burial workers focused on disease transmission rather than psychological fitness. Examinations checked for tuberculosis, typhoid, and other communicable diseases that might spread from workers to general inmate populations. Mental health received no evaluation. Workers showing obvious distress were reassigned not for their well-being, but to maintain operational flow. This medical blindness to psychological impacts meant workers internalized trauma without support, developing coping mechanisms that often involved further dehumanization of their charges. Tool allocation revealed priority systems. Each crew received shovels, picks, and wheelbarrows sufficient for excavation. Entirely absent were tools for dignified handling. No stretchers for moving bodies, no devices for gentle lowering into graves, no equipment for maintaining coffin integrity during transport. Workers improvised with excavation tools, using shovels to push coffins and picks to drag them into position. The toolkit thus mandated rough handling through absence of alternatives. The geographic expansion of burial grounds followed patterns that maximized operational convenience while ignoring natural boundaries. New sections were opened based on proximity to existing excavations rather than soil conditions or drainage patterns. This led to some sections flooding regularly while others remained dry. Workers knew which areas would be underwater during spring rains but continued using them because procedural documents mandated sequential section use. The conflict between written procedures and ground reality created situations where following rules guaranteed undignified outcomes. Quality control measures focused exclusively on compliance with health regulations rather than burial dignity. Inspectors verified trench depths met sanitary minimums, quicklime was properly applied, and cover soil reached specified thickness. Never inspected were coffin conditions, body positioning, or record accuracy. This inspection regime communicated clear priorities: prevent disease outbreaks, maintain operational flow, avoid regulatory violations. Human dignity appeared nowhere in quality metrics, making it systematically uninspected and therefore unimproved. The financial incentive structures for contractors created races to the bottom. Coffin makers discovered they could win bids by using wood typically deemed unsuitable, knotted pine that split when nailed, green lumber that warped, recycled boards from other industries. Transportation contractors minimized costs by deferring vehicle maintenance, using horses near the end of working life, employing drivers at below subsistence wages. Each contractor's economizing degraded one component of a system already operating at minimum standards. Information flow patterns prevented learning from failures. Incident reports filed by burial crews went to corrections supervisors who forwarded summaries to department heads who compiled statistics for annual reports. At each level, specific details were abstracted into categories. Coffin disintegrated during transport became equipment failure. Unable to locate burial plot due to marker loss became administrative delay. By the time information reached anyone with authority to mandate improvements, all actionable detail had been systematically stripped away. The architectural psychology of Potter's Field locations created environments hostile to contemplation or respect. Flat, treeless expanses offered no shade for summer burials or windbreak for winter work. The absence of any aesthetic consideration, no plantings, no pathways, no benches, communicated that these spaces existed purely for disposal. Workers internalized this environmental message. They were not in a cemetery but a disposal facility that happened to handle human remains. Training materials revealed assumptions through their metaphors. Procedures compared burial operations to warehouse management, with bodies as inventory requiring processing before storage. Efficiency metrics used manufacturing terminology, throughput, capacity utilization, process optimization. This linguistic framework shaped thinking, making it natural to approach burial work as industrial process rather than sacred duty. Language preceded and enabled systematic dehumanization. The emergence of competing institutional demands created zero-sum resource allocation. When Randall's Island also housed hospital facilities, juvenile reformatories, and insane asylums, each institution competed for limited island resources: fresh water, food supplies, maintenance attention, and administrative oversight. Potter's Field, serving the dead rather than living, invariably lost these competitions. Water shortages hit burial crews first. Food quality declined most for those feeding burial workers. Maintenance deferred longest for burial infrastructure. The institutional hierarchy placed the unnamed dead last in all resource considerations. These accumulated latent conditions created what organizational theorists would later term normalization of deviance. The gradual acceptance of lower standards until degraded practices became baseline expectations. Each small erosion in dignity seemed reasonable given constraints. Viewed systematically, they transformed burial from sacred ritual to industrial processing. The latent conditions didn't cause specific failures. They made failure inevitable by creating environments where dignity erosion was the path of least resistance. The human factors traps were particularly insidious because they protected necessary psychological functioning while destroying human compassion. Workers needed emotional protection to handle decomposing remains daily. The system provided that protection through complete dehumanization. Workers needed simplified procedures to manage high volumes. The system provided simplification by eliminating all dignitary considerations. Workers needed clear priorities when resources were constrained. The system clarified by making efficiency the only metric. Each accommodation to human limitations created conditions for systematic dignity violations. By the time Potter's Field operations were routine, every component reinforced every other in maintaining minimal standards. Infrastructure degraded to the point where proper burial became physically impossible. Training inculcated attitudes where dignity seemed irrelevant. Organizations structured themselves to prevent improvement. Resources were allocated to ensure only bare continuation. Information systems prevented learning. Human factors engineering protected workers by destroying their capacity for compassion. The system achieved perfect homeostasis around systematized dehumanization, making reform nearly impossible without complete reconstruction. The latent conditions had become the system itself. The transformation of Potter's Field from a functional, if undignified, disposal system into a site of active horror began not with a singular catastrophic event, but through the intersection of urban growth patterns with embedded system vulnerabilities. In 1851, the Common Council authorized expansion of 49th Street directly through the existing Potter's Field grounds. This decision initiated a cascade of revelations that would expose the gulf between administrative records and physical reality. The initial survey for the street expansion revealed the first discrepancies. City engineers, working from official burial records, expected to find orderly rows of graves extending to documented depths. Instead, their test excavations uncovered a chaotic underground landscape. Coffins appeared at random depths, some barely 18 inches below surface, others 12 feet down. The neat grid system existed only on paper. Decades of hasty burials, erosion, and unauthorized reuse had created a three-dimensional maze of remains. The engineering report, filed March 15, 1851, noted these irregularities in technical language that obscured their human implications. Subsurface conditions show significant deviation from recorded positions, the surveyor wrote. Wooden containers appear at variable depths and orientations, requiring adjusted excavation protocols. Nowhere did the report acknowledge that these wooden containers held human beings whose burial locations had been lost through systematic negligence. Work commenced in May 1851 with crews instructed to remove remains with appropriate care for reburial at the new Randall's Island site. The contractor, selected through standard low-bid process, employed day laborers at minimal wages, with no experience in exhumation. Supervisors, focused on meeting schedule milestones, emphasized speed. The combination of inexperienced workers, timeline pressure, and degraded coffin conditions created immediate problems. Within the first week, workers encountered coffins so deteriorated that they disintegrated upon contact. The pine boards, never high quality and subjected to years of moisture and chemical decomposition, crumbled when touched. Bodies tumbled out in various states of decay. The work crew's solution was pragmatic. They shoveled remains into wheelbarrows for bulk transport. Individual identification, already unlikely given record inaccuracies, became impossible once remains were mixed. The temporal sequence revealed how quickly orderly process devolved into chaos. Day 1. Workers carefully exposed and attempted to lift intact coffins. Day 3. After multiple collapses, they began breaking open coffins to remove contents. Day 5. Abandoning coffin integrity entirely, they treated the excavation as bulk earth-moving. Day 8. Supervisors, noting the slow progress, authorized use of picks and shovels without regard for maintaining remains separation. Within 2 weeks, what began as exhumation had become mining. Public visibility transformed administrative failure into civic scandal. The worksite, previously hidden in an undeveloped area, now sat at the intersection of expanding neighborhoods. Residents walking to work passed exposed burial pits. Children, naturally curious, approached excavations during lunch breaks when workers left sites unguarded. The sight of skulls, femurs, and rib cages scattered in excavation. Spoil piles created visceral reactions that administrative language couldn't minimize. The New York Daily Tribune's coverage, beginning June 1851, used language that pierced bureaucratic euphemism. "The bodies of paupers lie exposed to sun and rain," reporter George Foster wrote. "Bones of men, women, and infants are scattered with no more care than refuse from a construction site." The public, accustomed to death sanitized through funeral rituals, confronted the raw reality of how their city treated the friendless dead. Official responses revealed the chasm between administrative perception and ground truth. The Commissioner of Streets insisted work proceeded according to established protocols. The Department of Almshouses noted that all remains are being carefully relocated to appropriate facilities. These statements, technically accurate within narrow bureaucratic definitions, bore no relationship to witnesses' accounts of bones scattered across work sites, skulls rolling down excavation slopes, and workers using femurs to prop open lunch containers. The chemistry of decomposition created particular horrors as summer temperatures rose. Bodies buried with quicklime had partially skeletonized, but soft tissues remained in various states of decay. The excavation released trapped gases, creating stenches that drifted across neighborhoods. Workers covered faces with cloth soaked in camphor, but nothing prevented the smell from permeating clothes, hair, and skin. The olfactory assault made the invisible visible. Thousands of dead whose existence the city had forgotten suddenly announced their presence through putrefaction. Attempts at systematic record-keeping during relocation revealed the fiction of earlier documentation. Workers were supposed to maintain burial integrity by keeping remains from each section together, but sections had no physical boundaries underground. Years of burials had created interpenetrating layers where one grave cut through another, where erosion had shifted remains, where unauthorized reuse had stacked new bodies atop old. The careful numerical system in ledgers corresponded to nothing recoverable from the earth. The decision matrix facing supervisors demonstrated how operational pressures overrode dignity at every choice point. When intact coffins were found, Removing them carefully took hours. Breaking them open took minutes. When remains were scattered, gathering them individually took days. Scooping them collectively took hours. When identification was theoretically possible through position, careful mapping took weeks. Bulk removal took days. At every decision, efficiency won. The schedule demanded 100 bodies relocated daily. Meeting that quota required abandoning any pretense of individual treatment. Archaeological evidence emerged that contradicted official histories. Workers found remains far below depths that should have contained only recent burials. Investigation revealed unauthorized practices dating back decades. When trenches filled, workers had dug deeper rather than moving to new sections. When winter froze ground, they had reopened old trenches rather than waiting for thaw. When epidemics overwhelmed capacity, they had stacked bodies in whatever spaces existed. The orderly system had never existed except in administrative imagination. The mechanical processes of excavation created their own indignities. Steam shovels, introduced to speed work, couldn't distinguish between soil and remains. Operators, paid by cubic yard moved, had no incentive for careful excavation. The machine's buckets emerged festooned with clothing fragments, bones, and decomposed tissue. Workers manually separated human remains from dirt, but only cursorily. An unknown percentage of Potter's Field simply became fill material for other construction projects. Weather variations revealed how the work schedule ignored natural conditions affecting remains. Rain turned excavation pits into muddy pools where bones floated and sank unpredictably. Workers waded through organic slurries to retrieve visible remains. Summer heat accelerated decomposition of newly exposed bodies, creating health hazards that required even faster removal. Winter freezes locked remains in ice that shattered bones during extraction. Each season brought specific horrors that procedures hadn't anticipated. The transport phase created new dignitary violations. Remains were loaded into standard construction wagons without separation or categorization. The journey to river docks for transport to Randall's Island took hours through city streets. Wagons leaked fluids that left trails marking their passage. Bones occasionally fell through loose boards, lying in streets until someone bothered to retrieve them. The visible transport of anonymous remains through populated areas created public spectacle of municipal callousness. Documentation during relocation revealed the impossibility of maintaining identity through the process. Workers filled out forms indicating numbers of remains moved, but these were estimates based on skull counts, themselves unreliable given fragmentation. A single wagon might carry portions of 50 individuals, impossible to separate or quantify accurately. The new burial ground at Randall's Island received shipments documented only as approximately 300 remains from Section 12, without any possibility of reconstruction. The psychological impact on workers manifested in breakdown of normal behaviors. Initial crews had maintained some dignity, removing hats when uncovering children's remains or attempting to keep skeletons articulated. As work progressed and pressures mounted, these gestures disappeared. Workers were observed playing catch with skulls, using femurs as tools, making grotesque arrangements of bones during breaks. This wasn't inherent callousness but psychological protection against daily horror. Treating remains as objects was the only way to continue functioning. Night work, instituted to meet schedules, created particularly macabre scenes. Calcium lanterns cast dancing shadows across excavation pits filled with partially exposed remains. Workers, already psychologically stressed, reported hallucinations and nightmares. Several quit despite needing wages. Those who continued developed increasingly callous attitudes, referring to remains with nicknames, creating games around gruesome discoveries. The darkness both hid and amplified the horror of their task. The public health justifications for rapid work created their own contradictions. Officials cited disease risk from exposed remains, demanding faster excavation. But speed meant less careful handling, more scattered remains, more exposure of decomposing tissue. The rushed work created exactly the health hazards it supposedly prevented. Neighbors complained of rats emerging from excavations, of flies breeding in exposed remains, of domestic animals carrying off bones. Each acceleration to address problems created new ones. By autumn 1851, the character of the work had transformed entirely from its initial conception. What began as respectful relocation had become strip mining of human remains. Workers no longer pretended to maintain burial integrity. Supervisors no longer filed detailed reports. The public no longer believed official assurances. The physical reality of scattered bones, putrefying tissues, and mechanical excavation had overwhelmed all administrative fictions. The divergence between plan and execution was complete. The institutional response patterns during the excavation crisis revealed how bureaucratic structures prevented acknowledgement of reality. When newspaper reports described chaotic bone scattering, officials responded with statistics about successful relocations completed on schedule. When neighborhood committees presented petitions describing health hazards, administrators cited regulations being followed. This systematic deflection created parallel narratives: the official version where orderly relocation proceeded smoothly, and the witnessed reality where human remains were mined like gravel. Chemical analysis of soil from the excavation, conducted by concerned physicians, revealed contamination levels that made official health claims absurd. Decades of quicklime application had created caustic soil conditions. Decomposition products had generated ammonia concentrations that burned workers' skin. Heavy metal residues from cheap coffin hardware created toxic exposure risks. Yet health department reports continued to describe the work as following established sanitary protocols. The chemical reality was documented but systematically ignored. The economic calculations driving the work revealed priorities stripped of pretense. Original estimates budgeted 6 months for careful relocation of 15,000 remains. When bids came in, the lowest proposed completing work in 3 months by efficiency improvements. City officials, seeing 50% cost savings, approved without questioning how such acceleration was possible. The contractor's method was simple: abandon any attempt at individual handling. The mathematics were stark. Careful exhumation cost $3 per body, bulk excavation cost 50 cents per cubic yard. Economics mandated dehumanization. Worker testimony, collected years later during reform investigations, revealed the daily degradation of human feeling. "First day, I said a prayer when we found a child," laborer Patrick Murphy recalled. "By the first week, I was tossing them like cordwood. By the second week, I didn't see bodies anymore, just work to finish." This transformation wasn't moral failure but psychological necessity. The system required workers to either quit or stop seeing humanity in human remains. Most needed wages too desperately to quit. The stratigraphy of burials exposed during deep excavation told stories that contradicted official records. Layers supposedly containing only 1840s burials included military buttons from the War of 1812. Sections documented as adult burials revealed dense concentrations of infant remains. The archaeological evidence showed decades of false record-keeping, unauthorized burial practices, and systematic lies about where bodies were placed. Each shovel of earth revealed new evidence that the potter's field system had never functioned as claimed. Biological processes created particular challenges as excavation disturbed anaerobic environments. Bodies buried in waterlogged sections had undergone adipocere formation, converting to waxy substances that retained grotesque human forms. Workers encountered remains that appeared almost lifelike until touched, when they collapsed into greasy masses. These discoveries were particularly disturbing, breaking through psychological defenses that skeletal remains didn't breach. Several workers reported being unable to eat for days after encountering adipocere formations. The timeline compression created cascading quality failures. Original plans included photographing each excavation section for records. This was abandoned by day 3. Plans to maintain section integrity during transport lasted a week. Intentions to provide religious officials opportunity to pray over remains ended when the schedule made pauses impossible. Each abandoned quality measure was reasonable in isolation, but cumulatively transformed the operation from relocation to disposal. Material evidence of identity occasionally surfaced. A rosary twined around finger bones, military medals corroded but recognizable, wedding rings on skeletal hands. Procedures required these items be cataloged and preserved. In practice, workers pocketed valuable metals and discarded religious items as contaminated material. The systematic theft of the dead's only remaining possessions added another layer of violation to the process. Even these minimal connections to identity were severed by economic incentive. The geographic expansion of the work zone created new exposures of old secrets. As excavation moved beyond planned street routes to clear adjacent lots, workers uncovered burial areas absent from any official records. These irregular interments showed signs of hasty concealment, bodies buried at odd angles, multiple remains crammed into single holes, positioning suggesting they were thrown rather than placed. Investigation revealed these were overflow burials from epidemics when official capacity was exceeded. Rather than admit inadequacy, administrators had authorized secret burials subsequently omitted from records. Meteorological records correlated with work reports showed how weather extremes created specific indignities. A July heat wave coincided with exposure of a section containing recent burials. The accelerated decomposition created conditions workers described as inhuman. August thunderstorms flooded excavations, creating a soup of mud, bones, and decomposition fluids that had to be pumped out and filtered for remains. September's first frost caught excavations open, requiring ice breaking to continue work. Each weather event multiplied the horror while schedules remained inflexible. The night shift reports contained increasingly surreal entries as exhausted workers struggled with inadequate lighting and psychological stress. Found approximate 20 skulls in northwest corner, read one entry. Unable to locate associated remains, bagged for transport. Another noted, excavation collapse during rain. Unknown number of remains lost in slide. Continued work in adjacent area. The bureaucratic language barely contained the chaos of darkness, death, and disintegration these workers navigated nightly. The transportation logistics created a secondary system of dignity failures. Wagons designed for construction materials leaked fluids that marked their routes through city streets. Dock workers at the river refused to handle the wagons directly, requiring special crews of the desperate. The ferry journey to Randall's Island often took place in storms that washed remains overboard. What arrived at the new burial ground bore little relationship to what had been excavated. The system lost remains at every transition point. Medical students observing the excavation for anatomical purposes documented conditions that official reports omitted. Their sketches showed workers knee-deep in organic mud, skulls used to mark excavation boundaries, long bones stacked like lumber for easier transport. These visual records, preserved in medical archives, provided evidence that written reports systematically minimized. The drawing's clinical detachment somehow made the horror more evident. This wasn't sensationalized but documented as scientific observation. The bureaucratic momentum prevented any reconsideration even as conditions worsened. Once contracts were signed and schedules published, the work had to continue regardless of discoveries. Finding triple the expected remains in some sections didn't extend timelines. Encountering burial methods contradicting all procedures didn't pause work for investigation. The schedule had become autonomous, driving human actors to complete tasks regardless of human cost. The system's own momentum prevented any correction. By December 1851, the initial phase of excavation was declared complete. Official reports counted 12,000 remains successfully relocated. Unofficial estimates suggested twice that number had been disturbed, with unknown thousands lost to erosion, theft, or simple disappearance into construction fill. The new Randall's Island Cemetery received shipments documented only by weight and volume, not individual counts. The transformation was complete. Human beings had become bulk material measured in tons. The public health outcomes contradicted every official justification. Respiratory illness increased in neighborhoods near excavations. Rat populations exploded, feeding on exposed organic material. Water wells showed contamination from burial ground runoff. The rushed excavation created exactly the disease risks that careful relocation would have prevented. But acknowledging this would have required admitting the entire operation's failure, something bureaucratic structures made impossible. The final indignity came in disposal of excess material. Soil mixed with bone fragments too small for collection. This material, tons of it, was sold as fill for construction projects. Buildings rose on foundations literally incorporating the anonymous dead. Roads were graded with earth containing human remains. The potter's field dead achieved a final diaspora, scattered not just from their original graves, but dispersed throughout the city's expanding infrastructure. becoming part of the very fabric they'd been excluded from in life. The complete divergence between administrative planning and executed reality revealed Pottersfield's essential nature. It had never truly been a cemetery, a place of remembrance and rest. It was a disposal system that maintained minimum gestures toward dignity only while convenient. When those gestures conflicted with efficiency, they were abandoned without hesitation. The 1851 excavation didn't create this reality, it merely revealed what had always been true. The system for burying the friendless dead was itself friendless, acknowledging no obligation beyond physical disposal. Every subsequent horror flowed inevitably from this fundamental truth. The systematic failures exposed during the 1851 excavation were not anomalies, but predictable outcomes of physical processes interacting with administrative fictions. Understanding how Pottersfield transformed from burial ground to mass grave requires examining the physics of decomposition, soil mechanics, and hydrological cycles that operated regardless of human documentation systems. The fundamental physical process began at the moment of burial. A human body, approximately 60% water by mass, immediately began exchanging fluids with surrounding soil. In properly drained individual graves, this process proceeded predictably. But Pottersfield's mass trenches created entirely different conditions. Bodies placed in direct contact transferred fluids between them, creating what forensic scientists term commingling at the molecular level. The neat separation implied by stacked coffins disappeared within months, as decomposition fluids permeated all barriers. Soil mechanics in the coastal environment of New York created specific challenges never addressed in burial planning. The subsurface consisted of glacial till overlaying bedrock, with clay lenses that trapped water. When trenches were excavated perpendicular to natural drainage, they became sumps collecting groundwater. Bodies in lower layers remained submerged, undergoing anaerobic decomposition that produced methane and hydrogen sulfide. Upper layers experienced aerobic decay, creating different products. This stratification meant a single trench contained remains in vastly different states, making any systematic exhumation impossible. The quicklime protocol, intended to accelerate decomposition and prevent disease, created unintended chemical consequences. Calcium oxide reacted with moisture to produce calcium hydroxide, raising soil pH above 12. This highly alkaline environment caused selective preservation. Hair and nails survived while soft tissues dissolved. Bones underwent partial dissolution, weakening structural integrity. When excavation disturbed these chemically altered remains, they crumbled to powder. The very measure meant to eliminate bodies made them impossible to recover intact. Hydrological cycles created seasonal variations in decomposition that records never captured. Spring flooding raised water tables, submerging lower burial layers. Summer heat dropped levels, exposing remains to aerobic conditions. This annual wet-dry cycle created what geologists term redox oscillations, alternating reducing and oxidizing conditions that accelerated chemical breakdown. Minerals leached from bones during wet periods couldn't redeposit during dry ones, progressively weakening skeletal remains. After a decade of cycles, bones that should have remained intact for centuries disintegrated when touched. The physics of coffin construction guaranteed failure in mass burial conditions. Pine boards, even when new, had moisture content around 20%. Placed in wet trenches, they absorbed water, expanding until joints failed. The weight of soil and bodies above compressed lower coffins, forcing boards apart. Within a year, most coffins had mechanically failed, allowing direct soil contact with remains. The progression was predictable: intact coffin, failed joints, collapsed structure, dispersed contents. This mechanical failure path operated identically whether documentation called the contents John Smith or unknown male 347th. Thermal dynamics in mass graves differed dramatically from individual burials. Decomposition is exothermic. It produces heat. In single graves, this heat dissipates to surrounding soil. In trenches containing hundreds of bodies, heat accumulated. Temperature measurements would have shown mass graves running 10 to 15 degrees above ambient soil temperature. This biological heating accelerated all chemical processes while creating convection currents that moved fluids upward. Surface soil above mass graves showed chemical signatures of deep decomposition products, revealing the underground thermal engines processing human remains. The three-dimensional puzzle of remains after years of burial defied any attempt at systematic recovery. Bodies didn't remain in place positions. Decomposition gas caused remains to shift. Coffin collapse dropped bodies onto those below. Soil pressure caused lateral movement. Water flow transported smaller bones. A body placed at grid reference A7-3 might have components scattered across a cubic meter of soil after a decade. The careful numerical system assumed static positions that physics made impossible. Mass balance calculations revealed the mathematical impossibility of claims about successful relocation. If 15,000 bodies averaging 150 pounds were buried, approximately 1.1 million pounds of organic material entered the ground. Decomposition converted perhaps 60% to gas and fluid that escaped to atmosphere or groundwater. The remaining 450,000 pounds of bone and resistant tissue should have been recoverable. Excavation records showed removal of approximately 200,000 pounds of burial materials. The missing 250,000 pounds hadn't vanished. They'd been dispersed into soil, construction fill, and storm runoff. Over half the physical remains simply weren't recovered. Chemical tracers told stories that documentation couldn't hide. Adipocere, the waxy substance formed when bodies decompose in wet anaerobic conditions, contained fatty acids that persisted for decades. Analysis of soil from Potter's Field showed adipocere signatures throughout, not confined to burial locations. This indicated extensive movement of decomposition products through groundwater flow. The cemetery hadn't contained its dead. It had been slowly releasing them to surrounding environments for decades. The feedback mechanisms between burial practices and soil conditions created accelerating degradation. Initial trenches in virgin soil drained adequately, but each burial cycle altered soil structure. Decomposition products clogged pore spaces. Repeated excavation destroyed natural drainage channels. Compaction from equipment reduced permeability. By the third decade, Potter's Field soil retained water like a sponge, creating swamp conditions in burial areas. New bodies entered an environment already saturated with decomposition products from previous generations. Biological vectors added complexity to the failure chain. Rats, attracted by accessible organic material, created tunnel networks throughout burial grounds. These tunnels collapsed during rain, causing surface subsidence that broke remaining coffin integrity. Insects boring into wood accelerated structural failure. Plant roots seeking nutrients penetrated burial spaces, further dispersing remains. Each biological actor operated according to its nature, collectively transforming organized burial grounds into chaotic underground ecosystems. The stratigraphy, visible during excavation, revealed temporal falsification of records. Theoretically, deeper meant older in undisturbed ground. But Potter's Field showed reverse stratigraphy in many areas. Recent burials below older ones. Investigation revealed the cause. When sections filled, workers hadn't always moved to new areas. Instead, they'd excavated deeper in convenient locations, placing new trenches below old. This vertical stacking violated all procedures but saved walking distance. The geological evidence exposed decades of unauthorized practices. Mechanical stress analysis explained coffin failure patterns observed during exhumation. A stacked burial system created point loads where upper coffins rested on lower ones. Pine boards specified at 3/4-inch thickness could support perhaps 200 pounds distributed load, but point loads from corners concentrated stress, causing progressive failure. Once one coffin collapsed, it shock-loaded those below, creating cascading mechanical failure. Engineers could have predicted this failure mode, but no engineering analysis was ever applied to pauper burial systems. The chemistry of putrefaction created specific hazards during excavation. Anaerobic decomposition produced hydrogen sulfide, methane, and ammonia, toxic gases that accumulated in buried void spaces. When excavation breached these pockets, workers were exposed to concentrations that caused immediate respiratory distress. Several documented cases of workers collapsing in trenches resulted from gas exposure, not exertion. The invisible chemistry of death created real risks for the living who disturbed these chemical tombs. Groundwater flow patterns, never considered in burial planning, redistributed decomposition products throughout Potter's Field and beyond. Coastal sites experienced tidal influence, creating daily reversals in groundwater flow direction. This oscillation pumped contaminated water through the burial matrix, accelerating chemical transport. Springs down gradient from burial areas showed elevated nitrogen, phosphorus, and bacterial counts. The cemetery was a point source pollution site decades before that concept existed in environmental science. The mathematical progression of disorder followed thermodynamic principles. Initial burial created organized systems, bodies in coffins in trenches and sections. But entropy increase is inevitable in closed systems. Energy from biological decay drove increasing disorder. Chemical reactions broke molecular bonds. Physical forces dispersed materials. Given enough time, the maximum entropy state was complete mixing of all components, which is exactly what excavation revealed. The careful grid system fought thermodynamics and lost. Material science explained the differential preservation observed. Iron coffin hardware survived while wood disappeared. Brass buttons persisted while fabric vanished. Glass medicine bottles remained intact while ceramic dishes fragmented. Each material had specific resistance to the chemical environment of mass graves. Understanding these differential preservation rates could have enabled better identification practices, but such scientific thinking never entered burial planning. By the time large-scale excavation began, physical processes had transformed Potter's Field from cemetery to chemical processing facility. The neat administrative fiction of numbered graves containing identified individuals bore no relationship to the underground reality of commingled remains in various decomposition states scattered through chemically altered soil. The failure wasn't in execution but in conception, believing that mass burial could maintain individual integrity simply through documentation. Physics operated regardless of paperwork. Chemistry proceeded independent of certificates. Biology followed its imperatives without consulting burial registers. The failure chain was complete because it began with denial of physical reality in favor of administrative convenience. The temporal analysis of decomposition revealed how administrative schedules created physical impossibilities. Officials assumed bodies buried for 25 years had fully decomposed, making plots available for reuse. But decomposition rates varied by orders of magnitude based on local conditions. Bodies in dry, sandy soil might skeletonize within 5 years. Those in clay-rich, waterlogged sections might remain partially intact after 50. The uniform 25-year rule ignored this physical reality, leading to gruesome discoveries when empty plots yielded preserved remains. Pressure differentials within the burial matrix created unexpected preservation patterns. Lower layers experienced pressures of several atmospheres from overlying soil and bodies. This compression excluded oxygen, creating anaerobic pockets where decomposition proceeded differently. Fats saponified into grave wax. Proteins underwent Maillard reactions, creating leather-like tissues. When excavation suddenly released pressure, these preserved tissues often exploded outward, traumatizing workers who expected only bones. The physics of pressure had created time capsules of horror. The chemical evolution of burial soil revealed progressive toxification. Initial pH might be neutral, suitable for normal decomposition, but repeated lime applications created caustic conditions. Decomposition products added ammonia compounds. Metal corrosion contributed heavy metals. After decades, Potter's Field soil resembled industrial waste more than cemetery ground. New bodies entered this toxic matrix, their decomposition altered by chemical conditions their predecessors had created. Each generation of dead poisoned the ground for the next. Microfracture analysis of exhumed bones showed stress patterns revealing their underground journey. Bones that should have remained articulated showed breaks indicating they'd been moved repeatedly. Compression fractures revealed crushing forces from soil weight. Spiral fractures indicated twisting as coffins collapsed. These forensic signatures told stories of remains that had been far from peaceful in their rest. The underground environment was dynamic, constantly repositioning its contents through mechanical forces. The fluid dynamics of decomposition created unexpected transport mechanisms. Body fluids, being denser than groundwater, sank until reaching impermeable layers. There they pooled, creating underground lakes of decomposition products. During dry periods, capillary action drew these fluids upward, depositing salts and organic compounds in upper soil layers. This vertical cycling redistributed human remains throughout the soil column, making any concept of discrete burial locations meaningless. Temperature gradients drove convective cells within mass burial sites. The exothermic decomposition created heat plumes rising through soil. Cooler groundwater sank to replace rising warm fluids. This convection transported dissolved minerals, organic compounds, and even small bone fragments throughout the burial matrix. What started as organized horizontal layers became vertical mixing zones. The cemetery had become a slow-motion chemical reactor, continuously processing and reprocessing its contents. Bacterial ecology in mass graves differed qualitatively from normal soil environments. The massive influx of organic material created population explosions of decomposer bacteria. These consumed available oxygen within hours, forcing a shift to anaerobic species. The bacterial succession, aerobic to facultative to obligate anaerobes, created distinct chemical environments. Some produced acids that dissolved bone, others generated gases that built pressure. The microscopic ecology drove macroscopic changes that transformed burial grounds into active biological systems. The crystallography of bone minerals revealed chemical histories. Fresh bone contained hydroxyapatite crystals in organized matrices. But exposure to acidic conditions dissolved these crystals, redepositing calcium and phosphate in different forms. X-ray analysis of exhumed bones showed complete recrystallization, the original biological structure replaced by geological minerals. These weren't human bones anymore in a meaningful sense. They were mineral pseudomorphs retaining only the shape of what they'd been. Mechanical resonance in coffin stacks created unexpected failure modes. When surface traffic increased near burial grounds, from construction equipment or even foot traffic, vibrations propagated downward. Coffin wood had natural resonant frequencies. When traffic matched these frequencies, resonance amplified vibrations, accelerating mechanical failure. This explained why some burial sections failed catastrophically while adjacent areas remained intact. The physics of vibration had selected certain areas for accelerated destruction. Gas generation rates followed predictable patterns that nobody predicted. A 150-pound body could generate approximately 30 cubic feet of gas during decomposition. In a trench containing 150 bodies, this meant 4,500 cubic feet of gas-seeking escape routes. This gas built pressure, creating soil domes above trenches. When pressure exceeded soil strength, explosive releases occurred, fountaining decomposition products to the surface. Workers called these grave geysers, documenting them as nuisances without understanding the underlying physics. The thermodynamics of quicklime reactions added another energy source to the system. Calcium oxide hydration is highly exothermic, releasing 277 calories per gram. A typical quicklime application of 20 pounds per body released enough heat to raise local temperatures by 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This heat pulse accelerated initial decomposition, while potentially damaging coffin wood through rapid drying and thermal stress. The chemical meant to manage decomposition actually destabilized the entire burial system. Osmotic pressure differentials created unexpected fluid flows. Decomposing tissues had high solute concentrations, creating osmotic gradients with surrounding groundwater. This drew water into burial areas, accelerating liquefaction. The resulting fluids, now enriched with decomposition products, had even higher osmotic pressure, drawing more water. This positive feedback loop created ever-expanding zones of liquefaction, transforming solid burial grounds into underground swamps. The percolation rates through disturbed soil explained surface manifestations. Undisturbed soil might have hydraulic conductivity of 0.1 inches per hour, but repeated excavation and refilling increased this to 10 inches per hour. Rain events that should have taken days to penetrate reached burial depths within hours. This rapid infiltration mobilized decomposition products, creating surface blooms of cemetery grass fed by human remains. The unusually lush vegetation above mass graves wasn't coincidental but consequence of hydraulic alterations. Electrochemical corrosion of metals created additional complexity. Iron coffin hardware, brass buttons, and zinc coffin linings formed galvanic cells in the presence of decomposition electrolytes. These batteries drove ion migration, transporting metals throughout the soil matrix. Copper from buttons appeared in soil yards from burial sites. Iron stained entire soil profiles orange. The cemetery had become an electrochemical system, its dead providing the electrolyte for ongoing reactions. Freeze-thaw cycles added mechanical disruption to chemical chaos. Water infiltrating coffins expanded 9% when freezing, splitting boards, like wedges. Repeated cycles progressively destroyed wooden structures. But more significantly, freeze-thaw affected bones directly. Water absorbed into porous bone tissue expanded during freezing, creating microfractures. After years of cycles, bones that appeared intact crumbled when handled. Winter hadn't preserved remains, it had been slowly grinding them to powder. The failure chain was therefore not a sequence but a web of interconnected physical, chemical, and biological processes. Each process influenced others, creating feedback loops that accelerated degradation. The administrative system assumed burial was a one-time event creating a stable state. The physical reality was that burial initiated dynamic processes that continued indefinitely. Every passing year made recovery of discrete remains less possible, not through negligence, but through normal operation of natural laws. By the time of the 1851 excavation, these processes had operated for decades. What workers encountered wasn't a cemetery that had failed, but a complex chemical-biological reactor that had succeeded in processing human inputs according to physical laws. The horror lay not in the violation of plans, but in the revelation that nature recognized no distinction between pauper and prince. Given identical conditions, all bodies followed identical decomposition pathways. The democratic equality absent in life manifested underground, where chemistry and physics reduced all to common elements. The true failure was conceptual, believing that documentation could preserve identity when physical processes guaranteed its erasure. The careful numerical systems, the regulated procedures, the administrative structures all assumed stability in an environment defined by change. Potter's Field failed because its designers never asked physicists, chemists, or biologists what actually happened when thousands of bodies were buried together in wet coastal soil. Had they asked, they would have learned that mass anonymous burial wasn't a policy choice but an inevitable outcome. The physics made it certain that Potter's Field would become exactly what it became, a machine for erasing human identity through entirely natural processes operating on industrial scales. Following the catastrophic revelations of the 1851 excavation, city authorities attempted to stabilize Potter's Field operations at the new Randall's Island location. These efforts, rather than resolving systematic failures, created new categories of crisis while maintaining the fundamental disconnection between administrative intention and physical reality. The establishment of Randall's Island Cemetery in 1852 began with promises of improved dignity. The Board of Aldermen allocated funds for proper arrangement and adornment, including planned shrubbery and systematic layout. Engineers surveyed the island's 75 acres designated for burial, creating an improved grid system with wider spacing between trenches and better drainage. The physical improvements were real but addressed only surface manifestations of deeper structural failures. Initial operations at Randall's Island followed stricter protocols developed in response to public outcry. Trenches were excavated to uniform specifications, 50 feet long, 15 feet wide, 10 feet deep. Bodies were to be placed in single layers until each trench contained exactly 150 adults. Children would be buried in separate sections. Records would track precise locations. For approximately 6 months, these procedures were followed with reasonable fidelity. Then familiar pressures began their erosion. The first crisis emerged from the island's isolation. While remoteness removed burial operations from public view, addressing the visibility problem that had created scandal, it created new logistical challenges. The deadboat schedule of twice-weekly service meant bodies accumulated at city morgues between runs. During summer 1853's heatwave, decomposition accelerated beyond what holding facilities could manage. The choice became immediate transport in whatever vessels were available or acceptance of advanced decay. Administrators chose transport, breaking the regulated schedule that enabled orderly burial. Irregular arrivals destroyed the systematic burial process. Instead of predictable twice-weekly deliveries of 20 to 30 bodies, the cemetery might receive nothing for days, then 100 bodies in a single delivery. Work crews, sized for average flow, faced impossible choices. They could maintain dignified individual placement and allow bodies to accumulate above ground or accelerate placement by abandoning careful positioning. The physics of decomposition made the choice for them. Bodies couldn't wait. The geological surveys that preceded cemetery establishment had missed critical subsurface features. Randall's Island, formed from river deposits, contained layers of clay interspersed with sand. These clay layers trapped water, creating perched water tables. Trenches excavated through clay into sand below became collection sumps for groundwater. Within months, lower portions of trenches flooded. Bodies placed in standing water underwent different decomposition than planned, creating adipocere instead of clean skeletonization. Attempts to address flooding revealed how solutions created new problems. Engineers installed French drains to channel water away from burial areas. But drain excavation cut through existing burials from the island's previous use as epidemic cemetery in the 1840s. Workers encountered unmarked mass graves containing hundreds of yellow fever victims. The drainage project became an unplanned exhumation, mixing newly discovered remains with current burials. The attempt to create order had uncovered previous disorder. The chemical reality of quicklime application at industrial scale created unexpected environmental consequences. Each body received 20 pounds of calcium oxide. With 8,000 annual burials, this meant 160,000 pounds of highly caustic material entering the island's ecosystem yearly. Rain converted this to calcium hydroxide, creating plumes of high pH runoff. Vegetation downslope from burial areas died. Soil became so alkaline that normal decomposer organisms couldn't survive. The cemetery was creating its own dead zones extending beyond burial boundaries. Wildlife interactions added complexity no procedures anticipated. Randall's Island hosted populations of rats, feral dogs, and seabirds. Shallow burials during rushed periods provided accessible food sources. Animals excavated remains, scattering bones across the island. Workers arriving for morning shifts found skulls and long bones dragged hundreds of yards from burial sites. The response was deeper burial, but this conflicted with drainage requirements. Every solution created new problems requiring further solutions. The record-keeping system, despite improvements, encountered familiar failures when stressed. During the cholera outbreak of 1854, death rates quadrupled. Record keepers, overwhelmed by volume, abbreviated entries. 47 cholera victims, various ages replaced individual documentation. Precision degraded to approximation, approximately 30 remains, northwest section. The careful numerical system collapsed when most needed, during mass casualty events that created the unnamed dead in greatest numbers. Financial pressures emerged as the island cemetery's true costs became apparent. Transportation expenses exceeded estimates by 300% due to weather delays and emergency runs. Labor costs increased as the original prisoner workforce proved insufficient, requiring hired supplementation. Infrastructure maintenance, docks, roads, drainage systems, demanded continuous investment. The city had budgeted for simple burial, but discovered they'd created a complex industrial operation requiring constant funding. Secondary health crises emerged from unexpected vectors. Workers developed respiratory infections at rates far exceeding general population. Investigation revealed that disturbed soil released fungal spores from previous burials. The cemetery ground itself had become pathogenic. Attempts to protect workers with cloth masks proved ineffective. The choice became accepting worker illness or abandoning burial operations. As always, operations continued. The winter of 1855-56 created cascading failures that revealed system fragility. The East River froze, preventing boat access for 3 weeks. Bodies accumulated in Manhattan morgues beyond all capacity. Emergency measures included commandeering warehouses for temporary storage. When the ice finally broke, the cemetery received 400 bodies in 2 days. The only possible response was mass burial in common trenches, abandoning all pretense of individual treatment. Winter had forced revelation of what the system always was: mass disposal barely disguised. Attempts at religious accommodation created their own contradictions. Catholic authorities requested separate sections for their faithful. Jewish burial societies demanded east-west orientation rather than the standard north-south. Protestant ministers wanted weekly services. Each accommodation complicated operations, creating irregular sections that disrupted systematic flow. The cemetery became a patchwork of competing requirements that satisfied no one while complicating everything. The emergence of grave recycling as standard practice revealed the ultimate system logic. The 25-year rule allowing plot reuse assumed complete decomposition, but exhumation for new burials revealed extensive preserved remains. The solution wasn't extended waiting periods but more aggressive chemical treatment. Quantities of quicklime doubled, then tripled. The cemetery evolved from burial ground to chemical processing facility designed to eliminate human remains as quickly as possible. Engineering studies of soil subsidence revealed progressive instability. The weight of thousands of bodies and their coffins compressed underlying soil. But decomposition removed mass, creating voids. The result was unpredictable subsidence that opened cracks, exposed remains, and destroyed surface drainage. Attempts to regrade only mixed soil layers, bringing deeper remains to the surface. The ground itself had become unstable, unable to contain what it held. Public health monitoring detected contamination plumes extending from the island. Wells on nearby islands showed elevated bacterial counts. Fish kills occurred downstream from cemetery drainage. The city's solution was to declare the water non-potable rather than address contamination sources. Warning signs appeared on neighboring islands while burial operations continued. The public health threat was acknowledged but not addressed. Labor relations deteriorated as the workforce recognized their exploitation. Prisoner burial crews conducted work slowdowns, demanding better food and reduced hours. Hired workers struck for hazard pay. The city's response was to increase prisoner quotas and hire desperate immigrants at below subsistence wages. This created a sullen, resentful workforce handling the dead with increasing carelessness. Labor unrest translated directly to dignity violations. The documentary evidence from this period shows progressive acknowledgement of failure disguised as success. Reports noted efficient completion of interments while documenting mass graves. Statistics showed improved systematization while describing chaos. Officials had learned to speak 2 languages, public reassurance and private truth. The gap between these languages widened until they described entirely different realities. Biological monitoring revealed ecosystem collapse around burial areas. Soil samples showed absence of normal decomposer organisms, replaced by extremophile bacteria adapted to high pH conditions. Plant succession had reversed, with complex communities replaced by monocultures of alkali-tolerant weeds. Bird populations crashed as food webs collapsed. The cemetery wasn't just processing human remains, it was creating ecological dead zones. The final stabilization attempt involved constructing permanent infrastructure, roads, drainage channels, and processing buildings. But construction required excavation, which inevitably encountered previous burials. Every foundation dug revealed forgotten mass graves. Construction workers refused to continue without substantial hazard pay. The infrastructure meant to organize the cemetery created new opportunities for chaos as past and present burials interpenetrated. By 1860, administrators privately acknowledged what they publicly denied. Randall's Island had reproduced every failure of previous potters' fields while adding new ones. The isolation that prevented public scrutiny enabled worse practices. The infrastructure improvements created new failure modes. The systematic procedures collapsed under predictable pressures. Most fundamentally, the chemical and biological processes of mass burial proceeded independently of human management. creating conditions that made dignified burial physically impossible. The stabilization attempts had succeeded only in revealing the intrinsic instability of mass anonymous burial. Every intervention created new crises requiring further intervention. The system exhibited what engineers term positive feedback, disturbances amplified rather than dampened. A cemetery designed for stable long-term burial had become a dynamic system in continuous crisis. The secondary effects, environmental contamination, ecosystem collapse, worker illness, infrastructure failure, weren't separate problems but emergent properties of the fundamental approach. The true lesson of stabilization efforts was that no amount of procedural improvement could overcome basic physical reality. Thousands of decomposing bodies created chemical and biological conditions incompatible with dignified burial. Administrative systems assuming stable states confronted dynamic processes they couldn't control. The failures weren't in execution but in conception. Potter's Field couldn't be stabilized because its basic premise, efficient mass burial maintaining individual dignity, violated natural law. Physics, chemistry, and biology voted against human administrative intentions, and natural law always won. The comprehensive investigation of Potter's Field began not through official inquiry, but through accidental discovery. In 1867, construction of a new seawall on Randall's Island required deep excavation along the shoreline. Engineers expected to encounter burial remains at documented depths of 6 to 10 feet. Instead, they found human remains at every level from surface to bedrock at 30 feet. The geological evidence revealed that the entire eastern shore had become a composite of human remains and soil, accumulated through decades of erosion, illegal burial, and systematic falsification of depths. Physical analysis of recovered remains told stories that documentation had hidden. Bone chemistry revealed nutritional deficiencies consistent with extreme poverty, rickets in children, scurvy in adults, osteomalacia from vitamin D deficiency. These weren't just poor people. They were people whose poverty had written itself into their skeleton structure. Lead concentrations in bones showed industrial exposure levels that would have caused neurological damage in life. The anonymous dead carried evidence of societal failures encoded in their very bones. Stratigraphic analysis exposed temporal falsification throughout the cemetery. Core samples showed burial horizons that contradicted all records. The 1832 cholera victims supposedly buried in Section 3 appeared in Section 7. Yellow fever dead from 1849 were scattered across multiple areas rather than the single documented location. Most revealing, recent burials appeared below older ones in numerous locations, proving that empty plots had been reused while still occupied. The underground reality bore no relationship to surface documentation. Material culture recovered during excavations revealed the lives of the anonymous dead. Buttons from military uniforms identified Civil War veterans who died in poverty. Rosary beads wrapped around finger bones showed Catholics buried without last rites. Jewish prayer shawl fragments appeared in sections supposedly containing only Christians. Chinese coins and jade pieces revealed immigrants whose community burial societies had failed to find them. Each artifact represented a failure of social networks that might have prevented anonymous burial. Chemical forensics on soil samples revealed the environmental transformation. Background soil pH should have been 6.5 to 7. Cemetery soil measured 11.5 to 13, more alkaline than industrial waste. Nitrogen levels exceeded agricultural fields by 800%. Heavy metals from coffin hardware created toxic concentrations, lead at 2,000 ppm, zinc at 5,000 ppm, copper at 500 ppm. The soil wasn't just contaminated, it had become a hazardous waste site through normal burial operations. Hydrological studies showed how Potter's Field had altered regional water flow. The mass of buried organic matter had changed soil permeability, creating underground channels that didn't follow surface topography. Dye tracer tests revealed that water entering the cemetery emerged in unexpected locations miles away. The burial ground had replumbed the island's hydrology, creating contamination pathways that would persist for centuries. Biological sampling revealed ecosystem changes extending far beyond cemetery boundaries. Bacterial communities in nearby waters showed dominance of decomposer species normally found in deep soil. Algae blooms fed by cemetery nutrients created dead zones in adjacent waters. Fish populations showed skeletal deformities consistent with exposure to burial ground runoff. The cemetery hadn't just failed to contain its dead, it had exported death to surrounding ecosystems. The examination of burial records against physical evidence revealed systematic falsification spanning decades. Recorded locations were fiction, burial depths were standardized lies. Numbers were estimates inflated or deflated for administrative convenience. The careful numerical system hadn't failed through error. It had been designed to create an illusion of order while enabling chaos. Every stakeholder, from gravediggers to administrators, had participated in maintaining documentary fiction. Forensic reconstruction of specific burial events showed how crisis became routine. The cholera outbreak of 1854 supposedly resulted in 200 Potter's Field burials. Physical evidence suggested over 1,000 bodies entered the ground during that period, with mass trenches dug at night and never recorded. The discrepancy wasn't error but policy. Acknowledging true numbers would have created panic. The cemetery served to hide societal failures as much as bodies. Interviews with aging workers revealed operational realities never documented. "We dig until we hit water," one recalled. "Then we'd just stack them higher." Another described winter practices: ground froze solid. "We'd build fires to thaw spots, bury what we could, leave the rest covered with hay until spring." A supervisor admitted, "Records were for inspectors. We buried where we could, how we could. The dead don't complain about paperwork." The medical examination of preserved remains revealed causes of death that challenged official narratives. Skull fractures suggested violence rather than disease. Cut marks on bones indicated anatomical dissection before burial, not after. Fetal remains appeared in numbers suggesting infanticide or abortion deaths, never investigated. The cemetery held evidence of crimes uninvestigated because the victims were poor. Social death had preceded physical death and enabled murder. Technological analysis using ground-penetrating radar revealed the three-dimensional chaos underground. Instead of orderly layers, the subsurface showed a complex mixture of voids, compressed zones, and areas of total mixing. Some sections showed burial density exceeding physical possibility, more bodies than space could hold, indicating extreme compression or dissolution. Other areas registered as voids where coffin collapse created underground caverns. The neat surface concealed subterranean disorder approaching liquid. The toxicology of exhumed tissues revealed industrial poisoning throughout the anonymous dead. Mercury from hat-making appeared in brain tissues. Phosphorus from match factories showed in bones. Arsenic from wallpaper factories concentrated in hair. These weren't just paupers. They were industrial workers whose poverty came from the very industries that poisoned them. Their bodies in death testified to exploitation in life that continued through burial. Photographic documentation commissioned in 1869 captured what words couldn't convey. Images showed skulls arranged like cobblestones where erosion exposed mass graves. Femurs protruded from walkways like macabre fence posts. Ribs created delicate patterns in eroded banks. The photograph's clinical detachment made them more horrifying. This wasn't sensationalism, but documentary evidence of systematic failure. Visual proof pierced bureaucratic language that had obscured reality. The economic forensics revealed true costs hidden through decades of creative accounting. Calculating actual expenditures including health costs, environmental damage, and repeated relocations, each Potter's Field burial cost the city approximately $500 in current dollars, more than a proper individual burial would have cost. The efficiency was illusion. The city had paid premium prices for degraded outcomes, hiding true costs through bureaucratic fragmentation. Legal analysis showed how regulatory frameworks enabled rather than prevented abuse. Laws specified minimum standards that became maximum practice. Regulations addressed procedural compliance rather than outcomes. Oversight focused on documentation rather than reality. The legal system had created a framework where following rules guaranteed systematic failure. Every regulation met enabled greater violation of human dignity. The sociological evidence revealed Potter's Field as a mechanism of social control. The threat of anonymous burial disciplined the living poor. "You'll end up in Potter's Field" was warning and prophecy. The cemetery's existence allowed society to dispose of those who failed economically without confronting why they failed. Each burial represented not just individual tragedy but societal refusal to address poverty's causes. International comparisons showed Potter's Field as particularly American failure. European cities had poverty but maintained burial dignity through public funding. Asian societies used cremation to avoid land-intensive burial. Only American cities created industrial-scale anonymous burial, reflecting particular combinations of capitalism, individualism, and social Darwinism that made poverty into moral failure deserving erasure. The public health outcomes contradicted every justification. Disease rates remained higher near Potter's Fields than other cemeteries. The concentrations of poverty the cemetery enabled created disease reservoirs. The rushed burials during epidemics spread rather than contained infection. Every public health rationale had been reversed by actual practice. The cemetery designed to protect public health had become a threat to it. Reform recommendations emerged from forensic analysis, but implementation faced institutional resistance. Proposals for individual graves were deemed too expensive. Suggestions for cremation met religious objections. Calls for better records encountered bureaucratic inertia. Every reform that might have restored dignity threatened established interests benefiting from the current system. The forensic evidence was clear, but social will for change was absent. The ultimate lesson from forensic investigation was that Potter's Field succeeded perfectly at its actual purpose: erasure of inconvenient lives. Every failure from a humanitarian perspective was success from an administrative one. The cemetery efficiently disappeared those whose existence challenged narratives of prosperity and progress. Physical evidence revealed not system failure but system success at an unacknowledged goal. The horror lay not in dysfunction but in function. By 1870, accumulated evidence made continuation impossible to justify, leading to another relocation. But the pattern would repeat because the underlying social relationships remained unchanged. Cities needed mechanisms to dispose of those who died without resources or connections. Potter's Field provided that mechanism while maintaining fiction of dignity through documentation. The forensic evidence revealed truth, but truth alone couldn't reform systems serving deeper social purposes. The anonymous dead would continue accumulating wherever society needed to hide its failures. The only question was where the next Potter's Field would manifest its inevitable horrors.